Hi friends, Josh from the Narrate team here. This weekend, Narrate concludes the series, Hello, My Name is Anxiety. Adam asked the question, what happens when we start each day by inviting God to point out our responses to anxiety, and shares a narrative from the Bible of individuals who normalized fear.
So Andy Crouch is one of my all-time favorite thinkers. I heard him first at a conference in Atlanta called Q. And Andy Crouch, just a little bit of background to Andy Crouch. He used to be the chaplain at Harvard, so he's not very smart. He doesn't really know his way around intelligent conversation. Actually, quite the opposite, obviously. He's the type of guy who is a thoughtful follower of Jesus and can hold audience with some of the best thinkers in the whole world. He wrote a book called Culture Making, which, if you're trying to understand the theology and culture of this place, is real central to the way we've formed and shaped this place. His most recent book is a book called Strong and Weak, and it's a conversation about power, something that he's been fascinated by in his last couple books. It's a book that I'm going to plagiarize heavily from in October when we do a series about power and politics, because we got to go there, right, in October. I mean, you can't get enough of the whole conversation, so we thought, let's bring it into church. Actually, from day one, we've always said we want this to be the kind of place where people on both sides of the aisle can challenge their party to get better, and so it won't be party-specific. It just seems like with all that's coming our way, it would be very important to begin to talk about what's at the base of all of this conversation and the desire for power, and how do we think about it and how do we use it. And I'm about as apolitical as they get, so you don't have anything to be threatened by unless you want me to be very political, and then you have a lot to be threatened by. Nonetheless, it's in that book, Strong and Weak, that he makes an observation that is, in one sense, very obvious and simple, but in another sense, I think leads to some really interesting conversations and questions as it relates to this series we're in about anxiety. See, he notes, and the way he says it is, never in the history of the world have so many people been so tightly wrapped by bubble wrap. But what he says is, never in the history of the world, and of course there's always exceptions to things, but never has there been a people represented by the United States today where so many people were so safe and secure. He would say that we know safety and we know security in ways that the vast majority of people, even who were at the very center of power a couple hundred years ago, they never even knew it like this. And as I was listening to him pontificate about how safe and secure, how bubble-wrapped we are, it led to this kind of weird observation. See, it strikes me that there's a weird correlation, because if you agree that we are incredibly safe and secure, which seems a pretty safe assumption, though I have to admit I've not studied it out to its core. But isn't it odd that in the one sense we would all seem to be so comfortable admitting, like, we are safe in ways most people have never known safety, medically, educationally, like however you want to talk safety, we are safe. And yet, if we've learned anything from this series and its response, we are being brought to our knees by what some would call a systemic experience of anxiety. And we talked about this at the very beginning of the series, that never has a word buzzed quite as much as the word anxiety buzzes. And people from other generations and other eras, this guy just said to me this week, like, Adam, we called it worry, some might call it fear, some might call it dread. But isn't that a bit of a weird correlation, that on the one hand, we are safe, our kids are more safe, just kind of run the list. We are more safe than almost anyone who's ever lived, and most than the vast majority. And yet we are dealing with systemic levels of anxiety to the extent that everyone in this room either experiences it or lives with somebody who does. To the extent that the pharmaceuticals associated with anxiety are some of the most profitable organizations in all the world right now. Weird correlation, wouldn't you think? And I guess part of what I want to get at this morning is to kind of pick and pull and prod a little bit and go, like, what is with that correlation? And whether you're a Bible person or not, there's a story from the text that I think can offer us some insight to that. And it's a story about a guy named Esau and his brother Jacob. Now, Esau and Jacob were the twin brothers of Isaac and Rebekah. And I suppose what you can't appreciate until you're a parent is how two people from the same DNA background are so vastly different. Like Esau and Jacob, they're twins. Esau's older, but it's pretty relative when you're an older twin, right? We're told in the text that Jacob is grabbing his heel as he comes out of the chute. So they're pretty tight in age. And in this culture, one thing that's important to understand is that Esau, he therefore got all the inheritance. And see, in this culture, writing your will was a really easy thing. It didn't need the tribes of attorneys or anything to do that. It was just a one-question test. Who's the oldest son? And whoever the answer was, they got everything. And there's like, yeah, but what about Jacob? What about Jacob? Is he the oldest son? He gets nothing. What about the girls? They get nothing. The oldest son got everything. Esau was a man's man, if you know what I mean, though I resent the term because I'm not one. He was big and burly and hairy, and he loved to play outside. I picture him, though it's, I suppose, in some ways offensive to his Jewish background, as being the type of guy who, if he wanted a meal, he wanted a T-bone steak, and he ordered it rare, like mooing when he cut into it, that kind of guy. If he drank coffee, there was no cream, and it didn't come from one of those fritzy coffee places. It was Folgers, and he ate it with a spoon, if you know what I mean. If he had a beer, it was Bud Light, nothing else. If he had wine, it was Ernest and Gallo, and he drank it from the jug, right? Like, he was just that kind of a guy. Jacob was all things the opposite. He was kind of a homebody. Jacob loved to cook. He loved to hang out with his mom. He didn't like to be outside. He liked to be kind of clean. Jacob's go-to meal, and in fact, he became quite a good cook of it, was red curry. And if he could get it vegetarian, all the better. Well, one day, Jacob was in the house cooking, and Esau, his brother, found himself returning from what I envision as a long backpacking trip. He hadn't seen modern plumbing for days, if you know what I mean. He'd been eating nothing but beef jerky and probably hadn't brushed his teeth for just as long. And he walked in the door, and he said to his brother Jacob, he said, hey, could I have some of your red curry? I'm starving for a real meal. Like, I know there's not even any meat in there, but could I have some of that? And Jacob says, well, yeah, if you give me your birthright, which is a pretty audacious ask. Like, yeah, if you give me your inheritance, you can have some. And before you go like, wait a minute, that couldn't possibly be true. Nobody trades their whole inheritance for a cup of red soup. Let me just, for some red curry, listen to this. He said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. See, it's red curry. That's what I'd like to think of it as, because that's quite a good meal. Famished, he said. Jacob replied, first, sell me your birthright. Now we go like, okay, this couldn't be true. No one trades their birthright for a cup of curry. And yet my challenge to you would be, when you leave here, swing by and grab yourself a newspaper. Turn on NPR. Maybe look at your own family history. Maybe look at your own history. And what we quickly see is, metaphorically speaking, we trade our birthright for a cup of stew all the time. Maybe it's not red curry. It's just a night at the bar. It's just a particular gal. We trade a marriage. We trade a business. We trade all kinds of things of incredible value for something of seemingly no value. Wouldn't you agree? And listen to what Esau says. Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me? Trade done. Now, Andy Stanley makes an observation from this story that I think contributes to this whole conversation about the correlation between security and anxiety. He says that one of the things we can observe throughout the human experience, and especially in the text, is that no appetite is ever fully or finally satisfied. Now, the great thing about this is it's relative, right? Like whether that appetite is a positive appetite or a negative appetite. I read somebody one time who said if you run more than 3 miles, you're running for reasons other than exercise. Right, so whether we're talking about mountain biking or business or money or meth or alcohol, whatever it is we're talking about, it just begins to kind of sound true, right? That no appetite is ever fully or finally satisfied, that any appetite you feed, it only grows. You don't feed an appetite and have it get smaller. Like that's part of the dynamic. That's where self-control and so many things come in. That's why those of us with OCD have the problems that we do. Because when you feed something, it just gets bigger, which leads me to this question. And this is where my brain went as I was reading Andy Crouch's book. Maybe our experience of anxiety has everything to do with our experience of safety and security. Like maybe part of what's going on here is as we have so prioritized safety, and listen, I'm all for it. Love the hospital, love modern medicine, like my seatbelt. There's lots and lots of things, like the passcode on my iPhone, right? Like, it's not that we don't like it, but maybe part of the dichotomy here is that the reason we are in a culture that's being brought to its knees by anxiety is because we are also in a culture that has so sufficiently fed and grown their appetite for safety. I just, at home I've got the football helmet my dad played with when he was a kid. And then I've got one that someone gave the boys that was used in training camp 10 years ago. And of course, if I'd remembered them, I could show you. But right, the one that my dad played with as a kid is like, you wouldn't put that on your dog today. I mean, we protect them more than that thing protected anyone. Watching a lot of baseball this year, I just observed like the difference between batting helmets today versus when I played baseball, when you played baseball. Like when I played, if you could get one that fit you when you were up to bat, it was like your lucky week, right? The team had 5 because there was 4 guys and then 1 on deck, and they were made of plastic, so they were protective in that sense, but the inside was made of rock, remember? Because it was this foam stuff that when it was fresh, like 7 years ago, before it sat in the back of your dad's truck all summer and winter succinctly for 4 or 5 consecutive years, it was soft, but now it was hard as a rock. Today, many of the kids get a brand new helmet every year. If I took the padding out of my boy's helmet, it would be the most comfortable sleeping mat that I own outside of my mattress. A lot of the kids wear these things called Evo shields, because remember when you take a ground ball, if it bounces, it gets you in the arm and that hurts. And so many of the kids now, they have these wristbands that are, 6 inches long, and it's a hard piece of plastic, so it bounces off the wristband. Some of the teams we played, and I'm not criticizing any of this, just trying to observe how security and safety grows. Some of the kids even, you're seeing this emergence of a heart protector, a hard plastic plate that goes over the pitcher's heart, because what we've learned is that a line drive to the chest can kill somebody instantly, and so some teams are wearing those. I coached with a guy who's from the East Coast. He was kind of shocked that our helmets don't have face masks like softball helmets, and it's coming. Or let's talk about your iPhone and the evolution of security there. Those of you with an iPhone 4, what are you doing with your iPhone 4, by the way? It's 4 digits, right? With some version of a 5, it's your thumbprint or 4 digits. Those of you with a 6, how many digits is it? It's 6 digits. My password for Gmail used to always be the same thing over and over and over. I just got an email a couple weeks ago that I didn't have enough digits in it, and I didn't have enough variation of capital. My point is simply this: the appetite for security grows and gets bigger, which leads me, I guess, to this thesis this morning. It's here where I want to kind of land this whole conversation. What if the safety, and listen, we love it. Thankful for the military, thankful for science, thankful for medicine, thanks for climbing harnesses, thanks for better batting helmets, all of it. But what if it's led us to believe that the goal is the elimination of risk? Like, what if it's led us to believe that fear is actually a negative emotion that if we're living right, we never experience? Like what if we've come to believe that fear is enemy number one? And if we're experiencing it in a marriage, in a business, in a leadership decision, then something's off, because we're not supposed to ever experience this. See, what I want to point out, first of all, is if that's where we're at, it would do us well to recognize first and foremost that many of the most successful people don't think that way. And especially in eras before ours, they didn't think that way. Darren Hardy is the editor for Success Magazine. He wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial Roller Coaster. It's quite a good read. He tells a story in there of an era long past when an elder who had an apprentice in some kind of a business trade, he doesn't say which one, he was walking across town and was able to divert his path through a cemetery. And he did that very intentionally because he came into this one spot where he stopped, but as far as the apprentice knew, he was just stopping to catch his breath. And it was at that spot that he said to the apprentice, he said, somewhere buried in this cemetery is the most successful entrepreneur I've ever known. Which of course led the apprentice to kind of scan the horizon and look around and use process of elimination to eventually go, oh, it must have been that O'Brien guy over there because his headstone's twice as big as any other and 10 times the size of all the rest. And this elder said, yeah, he was successful. And then he pointed at his feet, and there was a guy, William Smith, and he said, this William Smith guy, he was by far the most creative guy I ever knew. He had some of the best ideas, and yet he was so unwilling to face risk that he died poor. Now, for us, this conversation, it's not a financial conversation. It's a conversation about what does it mean to follow God, and can we do that absent of the ability to navigate and deal with fear? Another thinker from the late 18th, early 19th century from Germany said it this way, and it just, to me, this is unnerving. He says, the dangers of life are infinite, and among them is safety. And I have to wonder, could it be that we've so deviated from that mindset? Could it be that we've misunderstood that? And as people who, to whatever degree you're looking for the text for cues on how to live, it seems appropriate to remind ourselves that the text, over and over and over again, does not say do not fear, does say do not be controlled by your fear. Listen to what Paul said to the Corinthians towards the end of his letter. He said, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong. Does this sound to you like a guy who's assuming that the life that Jesus is calling them into is a life void of fear? Or is it a guy going, hey, let's be very, very clear. Fear is among the most dangerous things in the world, and if you don't have a strategy for confronting it, it'll ruin you. Listen to this one from Haggai, and this is just, some say there's as many as 365 commands about fear in the text. That seems it's a bit of an exaggeration, but nonetheless, there's a lot. But now, be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jozadak. If you read it fast, it sounds like you know what you're talking about, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. Does the presence of God mean the absence of fear? Or does the presence of God mean a strategy for fear? Seems one of the questions that the text would have us face. Or listen to Daniel. He says, do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed. Peace, be strong. Now be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. See, here's my question, and this is the question, what I really want to land this on is, what is something we can do every day and every week that can keep this whole topic of anxiety in front of us, especially for those of us who this is going to be a nemesis for the rest of our lives, and it becomes this: what if we could normalize fear? What if the goal was no longer numbing or avoiding, but what if the goal actually became that every day I face something frightening and I don't retreat? And the more I could do that, the more I'll build up the muscle to face it adequately. See, here's what I've seen play out in my life, is I think I can live a life free of anxiety. And I think a lot of what we've talked about up till this point is a big aspect of why. But ironically, I think my ability to do so is actually relative to my actually facing fears. See, when I go on a trail run, and this is figurative and literal for me, I'm sure you can kind of play this into your own scenario, whether it's business or climbing or a decision with your kids or baseball or whatever it is. When I hit a fork in the road and left is, for whatever relative reason, scary and right isn't, and oftentimes on a trail run, left is I haven't been on this trail before, or I haven't been on this trail in a long time, and right is I can run this trail mindlessly and I'm comfortable with it, and left is I'm going to go further than I normally do, and right is I know everything about this trail. I could run it blindfolded. What I've began to discover is if I go left, not only do I win because I face fear, but I win because I win because I remind myself that's what life is. Like, life is a series of confrontations with fear where we say yes or no to it. See, for me, there's this thing, and it sounds so cliche, is to go, but wait a minute, I think what's best for my anxiety is to be confronted with it every day. And to almost build up this muscle and go, wait a minute, this is normal. This is what life is. And as a Christ follower who actually desires to do more than like be comfortable and die happy, whatever that means, this is the goal. Darren Hardy, in his book, he talks about brain hacks for fear. And it deals with this idea of normalizing fear. And there's a few things that I think can be helpful as we ask this question, how do we normalize it? The first thing he points out, and we know most of these, he said it's the fear of fear that you fear. In fact, this was studied most recently, or the first study I became aware of, I guess, was in the 60s. There was a guy who really wanted to understand anticipatory anxiety and its effects, and so he chose skydiving as his mechanism. He wired up a whole host of skydivers, presumably many of them who were skydiving for the first or second time. He rigged them so that he could monitor their heart rate from the moment they boarded the airplane to the moment their feet hit the ground, having jumped out of the airplane and arrived back to the planet safely. And as he analyzed this host of data, what he observed is what we would all expect. As the plane rose in altitude, so did a person's experience experientially, bodily of fear and anxiety and all the things that happen to you when you become flushed with fear. But what surprised him was when people jumped, when they started like flying towards the earth with a glorified bedsheet over their head and some ropes tied to their back, the point at which they jumped, guess what happened to their anxiety? It didn't just gradually fall either. It plummeted almost instantly to normal. And this was the beginning of this conversation of, wait a minute, it's the anticipation that's the worst part. Which doesn't necessarily make it any easier, but it does mean that it's the moment where you get to the trail and you choose to go left, that will be the scariest part. Everything else is downhill from there. The other thing he points out, and we've alluded to this throughout this series, neuroplasticity and mindfulness all point this out, is that really what you need is 20 seconds of courage. That courage is vastly overrated. That what the science would say is, on average, you need 3 20-second bursts of courage per day. Which means, go to that next slide, 99.9305556% of the time, you can be a coward. Because the window of decision, it's not minutes and it's not hours and it's not days. In most cases, it's 20 seconds. Third thing that he said, and this to me has been, especially in leadership and work, when there's these kind of big, hairy, audacious goals or these big, like, I don't know that I can deal with that. He says this, focus on tasks, not outcomes. See, we get caught up in the, like, we're going to start this business or we're going to build this house. Don't do that. Just kidding. You can do that. I just don't want to do that. Sorry if you're a builder. I digress. Like, we get caught up on these big, giant things. And what those who study this would say is what you really need to do is boil it down and go, what's the next thing? And what's the next thing? You know, this is Jesus who says, why are you worrying about tomorrow? It'll take care of itself. Plenty of stuff to worry about tomorrow. Just zero in on this. It's James who goes, listen, you who say today or tomorrow we're going to go to this city or that city and do this or that. Like, you don't know what tomorrow brings. Just focus on this. I remember when I traveled to California a couple of years ago by myself, and for me that was a stretching thing to be gone for a week. What helped me was to go, I'm not even going to think about what I'm going to do on Wednesday. What I know is I need to get on this airplane. What I know is I need to walk around the airport. What I know is I need to get on the next airplane. What I know is I need to find my hotel. What I know is I need to go to bed. So what they're saying is just find the next thing. And the fourth thing he points out, and really we've already talked about this, is you have to habituate yourself to fear. The example that Darren Hardy uses is when he was a kid, he was terrified of getting hit by a pitch when he was batting, and so his dad took him to the cage, and he told him to stand in the batter's box. And I don't know, this might be child abuse today, I'm not sure, but he brought with him a bunch of wiffle balls, and he said, you just stand there. And he just started plucking him, just started nailing him with these wiffle balls. And he said to his son, does that hurt? And of course, his son's like, well, I wouldn't choose it, but yeah, no, it's not that big a deal. And then he took tennis balls and doink, 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 nailing him with these tennis balls. Then he had these T-balls, the soft, squishy ones. And he started hitting him with those. And yeah, that hurt a little bit, so he didn't hit him as much. And then he grabbed a baseball and he said, okay, so here's the deal. I'm going to try not to hit you. But in this batting practice, if I hit you 5 times, I'm like, man, that's not a very good pitcher. If I hit you 5 times, we're going to ice cream when we're done. And his point there is simply that what leaders understand, what I'm going to say Christ followers understand, what people who face anxiety understand, is the way through it is to face more of it, not to retreat from it. And so there's this weird correlation. And what if the correlation between security and anxiety is actually quite explainable? There's a second correlation that I kind of want to land this whole series on. And I really try not to be this guy, but I think on this one it bears pointing out. And that is this. We live in a culture that has generally completely eliminated their need for God. That generally speaking, and again, like I try not to be that guy, like to me, we're all salespeople, and so we don't tell people you should need God. We should help point out why they need God. Nonetheless, we live in a culture that has generally eliminated the relevance of God to their everyday life. That's why we exist, because we're trying to constantly go like, wait a minute, he's very relevant. But here's a weird correlation. In the text, God talks about fear. You could argue more than anything else. Jesus, for sure, says fear not more than he commands any other thing. Like fear and money, those are the 2 things that Jesus talks about the most. And listen, even if you're not a Christ follower, even if you don't believe the Bible is somehow from God, I do, but even if you don't, what you have in the text is a history of people who dealt with a life not all that different than yours, which means they dealt with fear and anxiety and dread. They dealt with worry. And one just 30,000-foot observation you could make of those people in this text is that perhaps their number one coping mechanism for fear was their embracing of a God who was somehow powerful and in control, who somehow they could lean into when there was things staring at them that they couldn't control. I was talking to a friend this week. It was a phone meeting, actually, and talking to this guy who, in my estimation, you couldn't find a person on the planet in the last 100 years who has directly influenced more people than him. And I'm talking like over a table. Somehow we got on the topic of his definition of a mature follower of Jesus. You know what number 3 is on his list? He only has 3. He says they don't worry. He says, as far as I can tell, worry is always tied to trying to control things you have no control over. It's all about outcomes, and we can't control outcomes. So we engage in the battle, we let go of outcomes. My point is simply this. Perhaps it's not such a weird correlation that we are in a world quite literally being brought to its knees by anxiety, surrounded by people who would rather numb it than face it, who are in search of the life where they don't ever deal with it, who are simultaneously saying that God's not relevant. Maybe the two are connected a bit. So here's my question. To the degree that you want this to be more than a series that was engaging for a couple months, here's how do we apply this? Here's my thesis. Here's what I'm going to do to try to keep this in front of me. What happens if at some point this week, you sit across the table from a friend or a group of friends, and you've already agreed that you're gonna sit across each other at breakfast or at lunch, or you're gonna grab a cup of coffee, or you're gonna go climbing, or you're gonna go for a ride, or you're gonna grab a drink, whatever it is that you're gonna do. But what happens if at some point this week, and next week and the week after, you sit across the table for some people that you trust and that you know trust you? And you ask some variation of really 2 simple questions. 1, what fears have you faced this week? And 2, what did you do? I'm thinking like AA, and that's not to in any way malign AA, actually quite the opposite. What happens? See, what an addict understands is the addiction is always going to be there. The temptation's never going away. What happens if we become so self-aware of fear? Whether it's a fear associated with a medical challenge or a business challenge or raising kids or all of the above, what happens if we sit across from people that we love and we more or less go, hi, my name's Adam, and I am addicted to fear. And here's the way I was tempted with it this week. And here's how I practically responded to it. What happens if we get that personal with fear? That serious. And you go we run out of time to do this for every issue we talk about in a series. I don't think we have to do it for every issue we talk about in a series, because I think there's a reason why Jesus talks about fear not more than anything else, because it's the single greatest inhibitor of the life God has for you and the way he wants you to serve him and people. What happens if your go-to in conversation isn't how's the weather? But in the right, appropriate kind of relationships, there's this almost casual, so what fears have you been dealing with? And what have you done with them? And for those of you who practice chair time, and man, I hope you're trying that if you're not doing it. For those of you who prioritize getting up 15 minutes early and turning off the Today Show and turning off NPR and turning off whatever it is and not checking your email and getting before God, what happens if you do that same thing with God? You know, something, it wouldn't be a new idea. Going all the way back to the life of David in Psalm 139, listen to what David says. He says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. What is that but a man who seemed to understand that fear can be so subtle, so indirect, that he can make decisions in a day and completely not even recognize he just made a fear-based decision. And so he creates space for God to go, okay, Lord, Were there any fear-based decisions I made yesterday? What happens if we stop looking for the life where we don't deal with fear and instead anticipate managing around or through fear? What happens if we just begin to confess fear is what will ruin my life, my marriage, my business, the relationships I want with my kids, my pursuit of a goal, whether it's a sports goal or a school goal or a career goal or whatever that is? What happens if we look it in the eye and say, I will create habits where daily and weekly I confess my unhealthy relationship with you, fear. And I'm not going to catch them all, but I'm going to be accountable. What happens if we understand that it's not that God is some escape mechanism from fear, but historically he has been tried and found to be the best possible coach through it? I know that's a giant idea, but I also feel like the more we confess that we learn nothing outside of relationship, the more helpful those strategies will become. So who are they? Who's the person, whether it's a phone call or a conversation, whether it's a new meeting or an existing meeting? How do you bring this to the very top of the stack? I'd like to pray for you. God, we're so grateful for the many ways that you've brought about transformation and change and new thoughts and new ideas on what is seemingly a new idea, but it's among the oldest of ideas, and that is how we're dealing with anxiety and fear and dread. Jesus, would you give us wisdom in our own battles? God, I pray that you would prompt us by your Spirit today, later today, tomorrow, this week, to really incorporate our desire to be accountable for our fears and our responses to them into our relationships. God, there's businesses represented in this conversation. There's marriages. There's broken relationships that need mended. There's any number of goals. Jesus, would you meet us in our fear? Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.